The sun was setting behind the tall buildings of the city, painting the streets in orange light. The traffic was slow and the sound of horns filled the air. Officer Brian stood near his patrol car watching the vehicles pass by. He was tired from a long day, but he still had one thing in mind. He wanted to make an arrest before his shift ended. It was not about justice anymore. It was about numbers and pride. Brian was known for being strict. He liked being praised by his seniors. He believed a good officer was the one who made the most arrests. But lately his record had been falling behind. Other officers had more cases solved, and that made him angry. He needed something to prove that he was still the best. That evening he saw a black sedan driving slowly across the street. The car was clean, but something about it caught his attention. The driver was calm, not speeding, not breaking any rules. Still, Brian felt a strange thought in his head. This man looked suspicious. Without thinking much, he decided to follow the car. The driver inside the sedan was a middle-aged man wearing a gray suit and dark glasses. His face looked calm and his eyes were fixed on the road. His name was Daniel Ross. To everyone else, he looked like a regular businessman, but in truth, he was not just that. Daniel was the director of a special investigation branch, a secret section under the federal government. He believed in law, honesty, and fairness, but he never liked to show off his position. Most people had no idea who he really was. Daniel was returning from a quiet meeting when he noticed a patrol car behind him. He didn't pay much attention at first, thinking it was just part of routine duty. But when the police car kept following him for several blocks, he started to wonder. He stayed calm, driving within the speed limit. Finally, Brian turned on the siren. The sound cut through the evening air. Daniel slowed down and parked by the side of the road. He looked at his watch, sighed, and rolled down the window. Brian stepped out, fixing his hat, and walked toward the car with a fake, confident smile. "Good evening, sir," Brian said as he leaned toward the window. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Daniel looked at him politely. "I'm not sure, officer." "Was I speeding?" Brian shook his head. "No, not speeding. But your car matches the description of one used in some illegal activity. I'll need to check your license and registration." Daniel nodded calmly and handed over his documents. His voice was steady. "Of course, officer. You can check anything you need." As Brian walked back to his car to run the documents, a greedy thought grew in his mind. He wanted to make an arrest. If he found nothing wrong, it would be another wasted hour. But what if he could make something happen? He had done it before with people he thought no one would defend. He carried small packets of white powder in his car, fake evidence he used to push charges when needed. It was risky, but it had worked in the past. He looked at Daniel's documents. The name sounded plain. There was nothing that stood out. "Daniel Ross," he said softly. "Looks like an easy one." Brian decided to make his move. He walked back to the car and said, "Sir, could you please step out of the vehicle? I just need to take a quick look inside." Daniel opened the door and stepped out slowly. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. "Is there any problem, officer?" he asked. "Just a routine check," Brian replied. He pretended to look around the car, glancing at Daniel's calm face. The man didn't seem worried, and that somehow annoyed him. He wanted to see fear or confusion, but Daniel just stood still, hands behind his back, waiting. While pretending to check under the seat, Brian quietly slipped one of the fake packets near the back floor mat. He stood up and gave a small smirk. "What's this?" he said loudly, pointing toward the packet. Daniel looked at him, his face unchanged. "I have no idea." "That's not mine." Brian raised his eyebrows, acting shocked. "Really? Because this looks like something serious. You know, possession of illegal material is a big offense." "I understand," Daniel said in a calm tone. "But I think you're making a mistake." Brian crossed his arms. "I don't think so. You'll need to come with me to the station." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He looked at the fake evidence on the ground, then back at Brian. "Officer," he said slowly, "do you always find what you are looking for?" Brian frowned. "What do you mean by that?" "Nothing," Daniel replied with a light smile. "Just asking." Brian felt a strange chill in his stomach. There was something about the man's voice, confident but calm. He tried to shake it off. "Let's go," he said, opening his car door. "You'll explain everything at the station." Daniel didn't resist. He followed quietly. Inside the car, he looked through the window as the city lights passed by. Brian felt a bit nervous now. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the silence. Most people shouted or cried in this situation, but Daniel was quiet. Too quiet. At the station, Brian brought him to a small room for questioning. Another officer looked at Daniel's documents and frowned. "Hey, Brian," he whispered. "This guy's name sounds familiar." Brian waved it off. "Probably just another businessman." The officer shrugged and left. Brian sat across the table, ready to start his routine. "So, Mr. Ross," he said, "do you want to tell me where that packet came from?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking directly at him. "Do you want to tell me where it really came from?" Brian blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel placed his hands on the table. "You see, officer, I've been watching cases like yours for a long time. Officers who think they can do anything. Officers who play with evidence. Officers who forget what the badge really means." Brian froze. His throat went dry. "What are you talking about?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Let's just say I work with people who investigate things like this." At that moment, the door opened. Two men in dark suits stepped inside. They looked serious. One of them handed Daniel a small badge case. Daniel opened it and placed it on the table. The golden letters shone under the light. Federal Investigation Bureau, Director Daniel Ross. Brian's eyes widened. His heart started racing. The realization hit him like a wave. The man he had tried to frame was not an easy target. He was the head of the very agency that could end his career in seconds. Daniel looked at him one last time and said calmly, "Officer Brian, you have made a very big mistake." The room was silent. The sound of Brian's heartbeat filled his ears. His plan, his fake confidence, everything was falling apart. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came out. Daniel stood up slowly, straightened his coat, and walked out of the room with the two agents following him. Brian sat there, frozen in his chair, realizing that one wrong act of pride had just destroyed everything he had built. Outside, Daniel walked toward his car. The city lights reflected on his calm face. He whispered to himself, "Some lessons must be learned the hard way." The night was quiet when Daniel reached his office. It was a large room with glass walls and the city lights shining outside. He placed his coat on the chair and sat behind his desk. His mind was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He was not angry. He was thoughtful. Daniel had worked for many years to clean the system. He had seen good officers lose their way and bad ones destroy their own careers with greed. He believed that power must always be watched, even inside the law. What had happened today was not new to him, but it reminded him how much work was still left to do. He pressed a small button on his desk, and his assistant entered. It was a young woman named Maria. She carried a tablet and a notepad. "Sir, I heard what happened," she said softly. "Do you want me to report it to the Internal Affairs Department?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. I want to know more about this officer. Bring me his full record by morning. Every complaint, every arrest, every report." "Yes, sir," Maria replied and quickly left the room. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked out at the city. The streets were filled with lights, cars, and people. Everyone was busy living their own life, unaware of the small wrongs that shaped their world. He sighed. "So many good officers," he whispered, "and yet one mistake can destroy trust." He opened a file on his desk, a project he had started months ago called Operation Mirror. It was designed to catch corrupt officers through hidden observation, testing their honesty in everyday situations. Daniel had planned to begin it next month, but now he decided it was time. "We start tomorrow," he said to himself. "This city needs to see the truth." The next morning, Officer Brian woke up after a sleepless night. He kept thinking about what had happened. His mind was heavy with fear. He knew who Daniel Ross really was now, and that meant trouble. He tried to tell himself it was a bad dream, but the image of the badge kept flashing in his mind. At the station, whispers had already started. People were talking about him, but no one said anything directly. When he entered the briefing room, the other officers fell silent. He could feel their eyes on him. Captain Morris, a tall man with gray hair, looked at him and said, "Brian, come to my office." Brian followed quietly. The captain's face was serious. "I got a call last night," Morris said slowly. "A very high-level call. It was about you." Brian's heart started beating fast. "Sir, Don't speak," the captain said firmly. "Just listen. You're being placed under review. You'll stay off active duty until further notice." Brian froze. Sir, it's not what it looks like. That man, I know who he is, Morris interrupted. Everyone knows now. You're lucky he didn't file a full report yet. If he does, your badge and gun will be gone. Brian lowered his head. Sir, please, give me a chance to fix this. Morris looked at him carefully. Fix it? The best thing you can do is stay quiet. I don't want to hear any more problems. Brian nodded weakly and left the room. His pride was gone. He sat at his desk, staring at his empty report sheet. Around him, the station was alive with movement, but he felt alone. The job he had once loved now felt like a cage. That afternoon, Daniel received Maria's report. She placed a thick folder on his desk. Here's everything about Officer Brian. It's not good, sir. Daniel opened the file. Inside were records of complaints, small ones, ignored ones, and some that were mysteriously closed without action. He saw reports of traffic stops with unclear details, missing evidence, and unverified statements. Daniel frowned. So this wasn't the first time? No, sir, Maria said. But he always managed to escape punishment. His captain said there was never enough proof. Daniel closed the file slowly. Proof is what we'll give them. He stood up. Send a message to all division heads. Operation Mirror begins today. I want 10 undercover agents on the field by evening. We'll test every officer in random stations, including Brian's unit. Maria nodded quickly. Yes, sir. By nightfall, the operation was moving. Agents disguised as regular citizens took cars, walked the streets, and visited shops, each with hidden cameras and microphones. The goal was simple, to test the honesty of local officers by creating small legal traps that showed their real nature. Daniel watched everything from his control room. Screens lined the walls showing live footage from different parts of the city. He stood with his hands behind his back, silent and focused. Target 4, Officer Brian, one agent's voice said through the speaker. Daniel's eyes moved to the screen. The video showed Brian sitting in his patrol car with his partner, a quiet man named Lewis. Lewis looked at Brian and said, Heard about your trouble, man. You okay? Brian sighed. Not really. My career might be over, Lewis shrugged. Maybe you should just stay low for a while. I can't, Brian said. If I stop now, everyone will think I'm guilty. I need to show I'm still a good officer. Lewis looked unsure. Then do it the right way this time. Brian didn't reply. He just looked out at the street, his mind lost between fear and pride. A few minutes later, a small red car stopped near the intersection. Inside, one of Daniel's agents played the role of a young driver pretending to make a mistake. The car turned without signaling. Brian turned on the siren and stopped it. He stepped out, trying to act confident. The driver rolled down the window, pretending to look nervous. Sorry, officer. I didn't see the sign. Brian looked at the license. Everything was in order. For a moment, his hand moved toward the glove box, where he still had the fake evidence packet he hadn't thrown away yet. His heart raced. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to feel powerful again. Then he remembered Daniel's calm eyes. The quiet authority. The warning. He froze. His hand stopped halfway. Everything okay, officer? The driver asked politely. Brian took a deep breath. Yeah, he said softly. Just be careful next time. You can go. The agent smiled and drove away. In the control room, Daniel watched the scene quietly. Maria turned to him. He didn't do it, sir. Daniel nodded. Good. Maybe there's still hope for him. Later that night, Brian sat alone in his car thinking. The street was quiet. The city lights reflected on his windshield. He felt empty but also strange relief. For the first time, he had chosen not to do something wrong. He pulled out the fake packet from his glove box. It looked small and harmless, but it had destroyed his peace. He looked at it for a long time, then stepped out of his car and threw it into a trash bin. I'm done, he whispered. The next morning, Daniel called Captain Morris. Keep Officer Brian under observation, he said. Don't fire him yet. I want to see what kind of man he becomes when he's given a second chance. Morris sounded surprised. You're forgiving him? Daniel replied, No, I'm testing him. The morning sun rose softly over the city, spreading light through the windows of the police station. The usual noise of phones, papers, and footsteps filled the air. But for Officer Brian, the day felt heavier than usual. He walked in with slow steps, still thinking about what had happened during the operation the night before. He had chosen the right thing for once. Not to lie, not to cheat, not to plant fake evidence. But even though he had done the right thing, he felt no peace. His name was still under review, his reputation was broken, and his future in the department was uncertain. He sat at his desk, pretending to go through reports, but his mind was far away. The image of Director Daniel Ross kept coming back to him, calm, steady, and powerful. Brian could not forget the way Daniel had looked at him that night. It was not anger, it was disappointment. That look had cut deeper than any punishment. "Brian," a voice said suddenly, breaking his thoughts. He turned to see his partner, Officer Lewis, standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you didn't sleep again," Lewis said with a small smile. "Didn't," Brian replied quietly, taking one of the cups. "Can't stop thinking about everything." Lewis sat down beside him. "You did the right thing yesterday. Maybe that'll count for something." Brian nodded slowly. "I hope so. But I don't think Daniel Ross forgives easily." Lewis leaned closer. "Maybe he's testing you. Maybe he wants to see if you really can change." Brian looked at his partner's face, thinking about those words. "Maybe," he said softly. "But I don't know if I deserve another chance." In his office miles away, Daniel Ross was already reviewing reports from Operation Mirror. The screens in front of him showed recordings from different districts, officers helping citizens honestly, some behaving rudely, and a few still taking bribes. He watched carefully, making notes. When he reached the recording from Brian's car, he paused. The image showed Brian stopping the red car, hesitating for a long moment and then letting it go without trouble. Daniel studied his expression. There was guilt in Brian's eyes, but also a spark of something new, maybe regret, maybe hope. He leaned back in his chair and said to Maria, "He didn't fall this time." Maria smiled slightly. "Looks like he's trying, sir." Daniel nodded. "Everyone deserves one chance to change, but we'll see how strong he is when the real test comes." "Real test?" Maria asked. Daniel looked out the window, his eyes thoughtful. People can act right when they are watched, but the real test is what they do when they think no one is watching. 2 days later, Brian was called to Captain Morris's office again. The captain looked up from his desk and said, "Sit down, Brian." Brian sat carefully, unsure what to expect. "The internal review is still ongoing," Morris said, "but Director Ross asked for something unusual." Brian's heart jumped. "What did he say?" "He asked that you be assigned to a new case on a special one. He said it'll decide your future here." Brian was confused. "A new case for me?" "Yes," Morris said. "You'll work with a small team from the federal unit. It's part of a new citywide program. You're to report directly to them." Brian felt a strange mix of relief and worry. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning," Morris said. "And Brian, don't mess this up. You may not get another chance." The next morning, Brian arrived at a tall glass building in the center of the city, the headquarters of the Federal Investigation Bureau. He walked through security, his badge scanned by the guards. His heart was beating fast. He was led to a conference room where 3 people were waiting, 2 agents and Daniel Ross himself. Daniel was wearing the same calm expression as before. "Good morning." "Officer Brian," Daniel said politely. "Good morning, sir," Brian replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniel gestured for him to sit. "You know why you're here?" Brian shook his head. "This city has a problem," Daniel said. "Some officers have been working with a group of smugglers. We need to find who they are." "I believe you can help us," Brian was surprised. "Me? Why me, sir?" Daniel looked straight into his eyes. "Because you've been there. You know how a bad choice begins. You can see things others can't." Brian felt something stir inside him. Maybe pride, maybe fear. "I'll do my best, sir," Daniel nodded. "Good. You'll work with Agent Miller and Agent Sam. They'll guide you. Remember, this mission isn't only about catching criminals. It's about proving who you really are." Over the next few days, Brian worked closely with the 2 agents. They followed leads, studied reports, and gathered evidence about the smuggling group. The case was tough. The group was careful, and someone inside the department was helping them. One evening, they sat in an unmarked car near the old docks. Rain was falling lightly on the windshield. The air smelled of salt and smoke. Agent Miller looked through his binoculars. "We've got movement," he whispered. "Truck number 2 just arrived." Brian checked the license plate and noted it down. "That's the same plate from last week." "Exactly," Miller said. "We'll wait for the pickup." Hours passed. The rain got heavier. The truck driver finally stepped out and met another man, a tall officer in uniform. Brian's eyes widened. "That's Officer Grant," he whispered. "He works in my station." Miller frowned. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Brian said. "He's been there for years." They watched as Grant took a small envelope from the truck driver and hid it inside his jacket. Miller turned on the recorder. "We've got proof," he said quietly. The next morning, Brian and the agents brought the footage to Daniel's office. Daniel watched it carefully. "Good work," he said finally. "This will help us clean up the department." Brian nodded, feeling proud for the first time in a long while. "Thank you, sir." Daniel looked at him seriously. "This isn't over yet. When we catch one, others hide. Be careful who you trust," Brian understood. "I will, sir." Later that day, Brian returned to his station. When Officer Grant saw him, his eyes narrowed. "Didn't think you'd still be around," Grant said with a smirk. Brian kept his tone calm. "Just doing my job." Grant stepped closer. "Be careful, Brian. Not everyone in this place likes you right now." Brian met his gaze. "I'm not here to be liked." Grant smiled coldly and walked away. Brian stood there for a moment, knowing that things were about to get dangerous. That night, Daniel sat in his office once again, watching the rain outside. Maria entered with new reports. "Sir, the team caught the first link." "What's next?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Now we wait. When a tree shakes, more fruits fall. Let's see who else was part of it." Maria nodded. "And Officer Brian?" Daniel looked at the screen showing Brian's picture. "He's walking on a thin line between his past and his future. Let's see which side he chooses." At the same time, Brian sat alone in his car outside his apartment. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Stop digging or you'll lose more than your badge." Brian looked at the message for a long time, his jaw tight. He knew this was no empty threat. The real fight had just begun. He looked out into the rain and whispered, "I won't stop this time." The thunder rolled in the distance, and the city lights shimmered through the rain. For the first time in years, Officer Brian was ready to fight, not for pride but for truth. The night was still dark when Officer Brian woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. He reached for it with sleepy eyes. It was Agent Miller calling. The clock showed 4:15 a.m. "Brian, we have a problem," Miller said in a serious voice. "Meet me at the bureau as fast as you can." Brian's sleep vanished instantly. He put on his uniform, grabbed his badge, and hurried out of his apartment. The streets were quiet, the city still half asleep. His car's headlights cut through the fog as he drove toward the tall building where Daniel Ross's team worked. When he entered the briefing room, Agent Miller and Agent Sam were already there, looking tense. On the screen was a picture of Officer Grant, the same man they had caught taking money at the docks. Next to it was a message, "Transferred, temporary duty outside city." Brian frowned. "Transferred? How?" "We had proof against him." Miller nodded grimly. "Someone higher up stopped the arrest order. They moved him out before the paperwork reached the Internal Affairs office." Brian clenched his fists. That means someone powerful is protecting him. Daniel Ross entered the room right then, wearing his usual calm expression. But this time there was a cold edge in his eyes. "That's exactly what we need to find out," he said. He looked at the team and continued, "Grant was only a middle link. The real people behind this are still inside the department, using their power to hide their crimes. We have to find the head of this chain." Agent Sam turned to Daniel. "Sir, do we have any leads?" Daniel nodded slowly. "We intercepted a call from one of the smugglers last night. They mentioned a commander who manages their police protection. We need to know who this commander is." Brian felt a chill down his spine. There were only a few commanders in their city's police structure. If one of them was dirty, it meant the rot was deep. Later that day, Daniel called Brian into his office privately. "I'm giving you a dangerous task," he said. "You'll go back to your station and act normal. Pretend you're still under review, but secretly you'll collect information about anyone meeting Officer Grant before he was transferred." Brian looked surprised. "You want me to spy inside my own station?" Daniel's voice stayed calm. "I want you to observe. Listen more, talk less. We'll stay in contact through Agent Miller. Trust no one else." Brian nodded firmly. "I understand, sir." Daniel looked at him carefully. "This will be risky, Brian, but I believe you've learned what honesty means now. Use that strength." Brian gave a small, respectful nod. I won't fail this time. When Brian returned to the station, the atmosphere was cold. Some officers avoided looking at him. Others whispered behind his back. But Brian didn't care. He sat at his desk, pretending to go through reports while keeping his ears open. After a few hours, he heard two officers talking quietly near the coffee machine. Grant's transfer happened fast, one of them said. Yeah, the other replied. Captain Morris must have friends in high places. Brian's eyes narrowed. Captain Morris? That was his direct boss, the one who had warned him to stay quiet earlier. He waited until the officers left, then wrote the name in his notebook. Later that night, he called Agent Miller and shared what he had heard. Miller's voice came through the phone. If Morris is involved, that's big. We'll start checking his accounts and phone records. Brian looked around carefully before whispering, Be careful. He's clever. He always covers his tracks, Miller replied. Don't worry. We'll move quietly. Days passed. Brian continued to act normal at the station. He handled small cases, filed reports, and joined patrols. But his eyes were always watching. One afternoon, he noticed Captain Morris leaving the station early. He followed from a distance, driving his own car several streets behind. Morris's car stopped near an old warehouse at the edge of the industrial area. Brian parked behind a truck and watched. A man in plain clothes came out of the warehouse carrying a small black briefcase. Morris stepped out and shook hands with him. The two talked briefly, then exchanged the briefcase. Brian took pictures using his phone camera. The view was blurry because of the distance, but clear enough to show the exchange. His heart was beating fast. This is it, he thought. After a few minutes, Morris drove away. Brian quickly sent the pictures to Agent Miller with a message. Got something. Looks like a meeting. Warehouse near River Street, Miller replied. Stay out. We'll send a team. Brian nodded and started his car. He had done his part. Later that evening, Brian sat alone in a small cafe near the station. He felt nervous but also proud. For the first time, he was doing something truly right. Just as he lifted his coffee cup, his phone buzzed again. It was a new message from an unknown number. You don't learn, do you? Stop following people if you want to stay safe. Brian's hand froze. He looked around quickly, scanning every face in the cafe. No one seemed to be watching him, but he could feel eyes somewhere. He quietly left the cafe and drove home, checking his mirrors all the way. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door and called Agent Miller. They know, Brian said quickly. Someone is watching me. Miller's voice was calm. Stay inside. We'll have a car near your building tonight. Don't open the door for anyone. Brian nodded. Understood. He sat on his couch, heart still racing. Outside, the city lights flickered through his window. For the first time in years, fear wasn't about losing his badge. It was about losing his life. At midnight, Daniel was in his office again. The agents had analyzed Brian's photos. The man meeting Captain Morris at the warehouse was identified as Leon Trask, a known smuggler who had escaped charges multiple times. Maria entered the office with a folder. Sir, here's what we found on Morris. He has hidden bank accounts and several property papers under fake names. Daniel looked through the pages silently. Then he closed the folder and said, It's time to end this. Maria asked, Do we arrest him tonight? Daniel shook his head. No, if we move too early, others will run. We'll let Brian continue one more day. Tomorrow we catch everyone together. The next morning, Brian arrived at the station. Captain Morris was already there, his face serious. Brian, he said, calling him over. We need to talk. Brian's pulse quickened. He followed the captain into his office. Morris closed the door and leaned against the desk. You've been acting strange lately, he said. Anything I should know? Brian tried to stay calm. No, sir. Just doing my duties. Morris's eyes narrowed. Really? Because I heard you were asking questions about Grant. That's not your concern. Brian shook his head. I was only trying to understand why he was transferred so fast. Morris smiled coldly. Be careful what you try to understand, Brian. Curiosity can be dangerous. Brian forced a polite smile. I'll remember that, sir. When he left the office, his shirt was damp with sweat. He knew Morris was suspicious. He called Miller from the restroom and whispered, He knows something. I think he's getting nervous, Miller replied. Stay calm. We're almost ready. That night, the operation began. Daniel and his agents surrounded the warehouse near River Street. Inside, Captain Morris was meeting with Leon Trask again. This time, they were finalizing a large deal, money in exchange for police protection. Suddenly, The warehouse doors burst open. "Federal Investigation Bureau," shouted Agent Miller. Lights flashed and officers rushed in from every side. Morris froze, his face pale. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his voice firm. "Captain Morris, you are under arrest for corruption and aiding criminal activity." Morris looked at him in shock. "You can't prove anything." Daniel nodded to Miller, who held up a tablet showing the video footage. Morris receiving the briefcase. "We can," Daniel said calmly. Morris's shoulders dropped. The room was silent except for the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Outside the warehouse, Brian watched from a distance. He saw his captain being led away in handcuffs. A strange mix of sadness and relief filled his heart. The man he had once respected was now the one he helped expose. Daniel walked over to him. "You did well, Officer Brian," he said. "You faced fear, you made the right choice, and you stood for truth." Brian nodded quietly. "I just wanted to make things right, sir." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you did." As the police cars drove away, the first light of dawn appeared in the sky. The long night was finally ending, and for Brian it felt like a new beginning, one built on honesty, not pride. The morning after the arrests, the city news channels were full of one headline: "Police commander and smugglers arrested in secret operation led by FBI." It was a big story. People were shocked to see the names of high officers who were supposed to protect the law. Many called it the biggest internal cleanup in years. Officer Brian sat in his small apartment watching the news quietly. His phone kept buzzing with messages, some from old friends congratulating him, others from officers at the station who couldn't believe what had happened. But Brian didn't feel proud or happy. He only felt tired. The past few weeks had changed everything for him. He turned off the TV and sat back. The air outside smelled fresh after last night's rain. He looked out the window and whispered to himself, "It's finally over." But he was wrong. It wasn't over yet. At the FBI headquarters, Director Daniel Ross sat in his office reading a thick report. Agent Maria stood beside him explaining the latest updates. "We traced the money trail, sir," she said. "It doesn't end with Captain Morris. The funds were sent to an unknown account registered under a false name, E. Klein. We think it's someone outside the police department, maybe a business partner who helped move the money." Daniel looked up from the papers. "So the corruption chain is still longer than we thought." Maria nodded. "Yes, sir. We believe this E. Klein might be the real brain behind the operation." Daniel closed the file slowly. "Then we find him. But this time we keep it quiet. No leaks, no mistakes." That same afternoon, Daniel called Brian to the bureau again. When Brian entered the room, he looked surprised. He wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. He had been on leave since the arrest. Daniel greeted him with a small smile. "Good to see you, Officer Brian." "Thank you, sir," Brian said politely. "I didn't think you'd still need me." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You've proven yourself more than once. You stayed brave when things got dangerous. Now I have one last task for you, if you're willing." Brian straightened his back. "What kind of task, sir?" Daniel turned the screen on his desk toward him. It showed a photo of a man in a suit standing beside a black car. "This is Edward Klein," Daniel said. "We believe he's behind the fake accounts and illegal deals. He owns a shipping company near the harbor, the same place where Grant and Morris used to meet their contacts." Brian studied the picture. "You want me to go there?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "We can't arrest him yet. We need solid proof that he's connected to the smuggling network. You'll go undercover as a new security guard at his warehouse. We'll provide fake documents and a new name." Brian hesitated for a moment. "That's dangerous, sir." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, but you've faced worse already. If you succeed, this case will finally end." Brian thought for a few seconds, then said firmly, "I'll do it." 2 days later, Brian began his new undercover role. His name was now Ben Carter, and his fake ID said he was a night guard for Klein Shipping and Storage. The warehouse was large and quiet during the day, but at night trucks came and went with boxes that no one was allowed to open. Brian kept his eyes open and ears sharp. He noticed that the workers avoided asking questions. Everyone seemed scared. Sometimes men in dark suits came at midnight, signed papers quickly, and left with sealed crates. Each night, Brian reported what he saw to Agent Miller through a small hidden phone. The agents began tracking the trucks and their routes. After a week, Miller told him, "We're close." We just need one more piece of proof, a recording of Klein giving the order himself. Brian agreed to try. That night, he hid a small audio recorder in his shirt pocket before his shift started. Around midnight, Edward Klein arrived at the warehouse. He was tall, calm, and spoke with quiet authority. The workers moved aside as he walked in. Brian stood near the gate, pretending to check IDs, but his eyes were on Klein. Klein was speaking to a man in a gray suit near one of the trucks. "Make sure the containers reach the east dock before sunrise," he said. "I don't want any police trouble this time." The man nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Brian's heart raced as his recorder captured every word. Then Klein turned around suddenly. His eyes landed on Brian. "You," he said, pointing. "You're new here, right?" Brian nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "Joined last week?" Klein stared at him for a few seconds, then said, "Good. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. We don't like nosy people here." "Yes, sir," Brian replied respectfully. Klein turned away and walked to his car. The moment he left, Brian took a deep breath. He had the proof they needed. Early the next morning, Brian met Daniel and the agents at a safe location. He handed over the recorder. Miller played the audio and Klein's voice was clear. Daniel looked satisfied for the first time in weeks. "This is it. We have him," Maria added. "We'll move tonight. His office will be full of documents and transaction records. If we move fast, we'll get everything." Daniel looked at Brian. "You've done well again, officer. You can step back now. We'll handle the rest." But Brian shook his head. "Sir, I want to be there. I started this with you. I want to see it end." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. You'll stay with Agent Miller tonight." That night, the operation began. The team moved quietly toward the harbor. The moonlight shone on the metal containers stacked high like walls. The air smelled of salt and oil. Inside the warehouse, Klein and his men were loading the last few trucks. Everything seemed normal, until the sound of tires screeching broke the silence. Black SUVs surrounded the gate. Agents in tactical gear rushed out shouting, "Federal Investigation Bureau! Drop your weapons!" The workers panicked and scattered. Klein froze for a moment, then tried to run toward his car. But Brian stepped out from behind a truck and blocked his way. Klein glared at him. You're not a guard." Brian held his badge firmly. "No, I'm an officer and you're under arrest." Klein looked around, realizing there was no escape. Daniel walked forward calmly. "Edward Klein, you are charged with corruption, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy." Klein tried to smile. "You think arresting me will change anything?" "There will always be more like me," Daniel replied quietly. "Maybe, but not today." The agents handcuffed Klein and began collecting evidence from his office. Brian watched as they found the documents. Files showing payments to officers, shipping routes, and illegal transfers. Everything was there. When the operation ended, the sun was rising over the sea. The sky was painted with shades of gold and pink. Daniel stood beside Brian near the dock, both watching the water. "You did it," Daniel said. "You started as a man with mistakes, and now you've helped clean the very system you once doubted." Brian looked at the horizon. "I just wanted to fix what was broken, in me and around me." Daniel smiled. "And you did. The city needs officers like you." A gentle breeze blew across the water. For the first time in a long while, Brian felt peace inside his heart. He had made many mistakes, but he had also found the courage to correct them. The badge he once wore with pride now meant something deeper: truth, honor, and redemption. As they walked back toward the waiting cars, the news teams were already arriving, flashing lights across the dock. People would soon know the full story, how one officer's mistake led to uncovering a whole chain of corruption. But for Brian, it wasn't about fame. It was about doing what was right. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go, officer. There's more work waiting for us," Brian smiled. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." The two men walked toward the rising sun, leaving behind the dark chapter of lies and stepping into a new dawn of justice.